The cough came hard enough to rattle Virginia Bennett's bones, making the crude wooden bed frame creak beneath her sweat-soaked body. The abandoned cabin she'd stumbled upon 3 days prior had become both sanctuary and prison as the fever took hold, leaving her too weak to seek help from the nearest town, a town whose name she couldn't even recall in her delirium. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon sunlight filtering through the cabin's single dirty window, and Virginia watched them with unfocused eyes, wondering if these dancing specks might be the last thing she'd ever see. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory had proven far less forgiving than the romantic tales she'd read back in Boston. At 22, Virginia had fled east after her father's death left her at the mercy of a stepmother who made no secret of her disdain. The teaching position in Promise Creek had seemed like providence until the stagecoach accident that had separated her from her belongings and left her wandering, increasingly ill, until she'd found this decrepit shelter. "Water," she whispered to the empty room, her cracked lips barely forming the word. The small canteen beside the bed had been empty since morning, and the fever burned through her like wildfire. Virginia closed her eyes, the sound of her labored breathing filling the small space. Then came another sound, hoofbeats approaching. Virginia's heart leapt with both hope and terror. In her vulnerable state, a visitor could mean salvation or something far worse. She tried to rise but fell back, her limbs too weak to support her weight. The hoofbeats stopped, followed by the sound of boots on the weathered porch. The door, hanging precariously on one hinge, swung open with a mournful creak. Silhouetted against the harsh sunlight stood a tall figure. Virginia blinked, unable to make out details beyond the broad shoulders and the distinctive shape of a cowboy hat. "Hello," the voice was deep, cautious. "Anybody home?" Virginia tried to answer, but another coughing fit seized her instead. The figure moved quickly to her bedside, and as he knelt, his features came into focus: a weathered face with kind eyes the color of a summer sky, stubbled cheeks, and a concerned frown beneath the brim of his dusty hat. "Madam, you're burning up." His calloused hand felt cool against her forehead. "Water," she managed to whisper. He nodded, reaching for a canteen at his hip. "I'm Hank Calloway." He gently lifted her head, helping her take small sips. The water was warm but felt like heaven against her parched throat. "What's your name, madam?" "Virginia," she rasped. "Virginia Bennett." Hank nodded, his eyes scanning the sparse cabin. "You're mighty sick, Miss Bennett. How long have you been here alone?" 3 days, perhaps 4. Speaking took tremendous effort. "Lost track. You need a doctor." He frowned, looking toward the window where the light was already beginning to fade. "Promise Creek's still a half-day's ride from here, and night's coming." Virginia clutched weakly at his sleeve. "Please, don't leave." Something in her desperate plea seemed to resolve whatever debate was happening behind those blue eyes. "I won't leave you, Miss Bennett." He settled his hat on the small table beside the bed. "You're not alone anymore." He moved with practiced efficiency, building a fire in the small hearth and retrieving supplies from his saddlebags. Virginia drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of his steady presence and the occasional cool cloth on her forehead. At some point, she felt a bitter liquid touch her lips. "Willow bark tea," Hank explained. "It'll help with the fever." As night fell fully outside, Virginia watched through half-lidded eyes as this stranger, this cowboy who'd appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer, tended to her with gentle hands that belied their roughness. Before sleep claimed her again, she heard him whisper words that would change everything. "You'll never be alone again, Miss Bennett. I promise you that." When Virginia awoke, pale dawn light was seeping through the window. For the first time in days, her head felt clearer, the fever's grip loosened. She turned to find Hank dozing in a rickety chair pulled close to her bedside, his long legs stretched out before him, chin tucked to his chest. His presence wasn't a fever dream after all. He stirred as if sensing her gaze, straightening with a soft grunt. "Morning, Miss Bennett." His voice was gruff with sleep. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she managed, surprised by the truth in the word. "Thank you." Hank nodded, rising to check her forehead with the back of his hand. "Fever's down some, that's good." He moved to the hearth where a small pot hung above glowing embers, made some broth from jerky, not much, but you need something in your stomach. As he helped her sit up against the wall, Virginia took a proper look at her savior. In the clear morning light, she could see he was perhaps 30, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes despite the serious set of his mouth. His brown hair was a touch too long, curling slightly at the collar of his faded blue shirt. "Why did you stop here?" she asked after taking a few spoonfuls of the simple but nourishing broth. Hank shrugged, settling back in the chair. "Wasn't planning to, was heading to Promise Creek for supplies when I spotted smoke from the chimney. This cabin's been abandoned for years, belonged to old Tom Watkins before the Apache got him back in '72, figured I should see who was squatting." "I'm not squatting," Virginia said, a flash of her proper Boston upbringing surfacing. "I was simply desperate." A ghost of a smile touched Hank's lips. "No offense meant, Miss Bennett. What brings a lady like yourself to these parts? You don't sound like you're from the territory." Virginia explained about her teaching position, the stagecoach accident, and her subsequent illness while wandering lost. Hank listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "The stage went off Walker's Ridge. You're lucky to be alive. Most passengers weren't so fortunate in that crash." Virginia's hand trembled around the cup. "There were others," Hank nodded grimly. "Word reached the ranch 2 days ago. 4 dead, they said, bodies taken to Promise Creek." "Oh God." Virginia closed her eyes, remembering the friendly elderly couple who'd sat across from her, the young mother with her infant son. "Who survived? Don't know details." "Just that some lady teacher they were expecting wasn't among the recovered." His eyes met hers. "That'd be you, I reckon." The realization that people might believe her dead sent a chill through Virginia despite the cabin's growing warmth. "I need to get to Promise Creek," she said, attempting to rise. The movement sent the room spinning, and she would have fallen if Hank hadn't caught her shoulders. "Whoa there," he said, easing her back down. "You're not ready for that journey yet, another day of rest at least." "But my position will still be there," Hank assured her. "School term doesn't start for another 2 weeks. I heard the schoolmarm talking about it last time I was in town." Virginia sank back, too weak to argue. "Your ranch, won't they miss you?" Hank shook his head. "I'm foreman at the CCC. Owner's my uncle, Hank Calloway. He knows I sometimes take a few days when I'm making supply runs." He paused, seeming to consider something. "I could ride to Promise Creek today, let them know you're alive, bring back a wagon tomorrow." The thought of being left alone again, even for a day, filled Virginia with unexpected dread. "No," she said quickly, then felt foolish at her own desperation. "I mean, perhaps we could wait until I'm stronger." Those blue eyes studied her face, understanding more than she'd said. "All right, Miss Bennett, we'll wait." The day passed slowly. Hank tended to his horse, repaired the cabin door, and hunted a rabbit that he stewed with wild onions he'd found nearby. Virginia drifted in and out of sleep, but each time she woke, Hank was there whittling by the fire, checking her temperature, encouraging her to drink more water or broth. As evening approached, Virginia felt strong enough to sit up properly and even stand briefly with Hank's support. Her fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Calloway," she said as they shared the rabbit stew. "How does a man like you end up in the Arizona Territory?" Hank seemed hesitant to speak of himself, but eventually the story emerged. Born in Missouri, he'd fought for the Union despite his southern roots, then drifted west after the war ended with too many ghosts following behind. He'd worked cattle drives in Texas before his uncle had offered him the foreman position 5 years ago. "Not much to tell beyond that," he concluded. "Just a cowboy trying to make his way." "I think there's quite a bit more to you than that," Virginia said softly. Something in her tone made him look up sharply, and for a moment their eyes held, The moment broke when Virginia's lingering cough returned. Hank busied himself with clearing away their meal while she composed herself. By unspoken agreement, he again took the chair for sleeping while Virginia had the bed, though he insisted on adding his bedroll atop the thin mattress for her comfort. Mr. Calloway. Virginia said as he banked the fire for the night. Yes, Miss Bennett, thank you, not just for the care but for staying. In the dim firelight his expression softened. Get some rest now. We'll head to Promise Creek tomorrow if you're strong enough. When Virginia woke the following morning, she found Hank had already been busy. Fresh water sat by her bedside, and the smell of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd expected, filled the cabin. Found these in my supplies, Hank explained, seeing her surprise at the cup of coffee he offered. Figured you might appreciate something civilized. The gesture touched her deeply. You're more civilized than you give yourself credit for, Mr. Calloway. A hint of color touched his tan cheeks. Hank, please, if we're traveling together, might as well use my name. Then I'm Virginia. She took a careful sip of the coffee, savoring its rich bitterness. Virginia, he repeated, as if testing the name. It suits you, proper but with strength underneath. The unexpected compliment brought warmth to her face that had nothing to do with lingering illness. How far is Promise Creek? About 15 miles east, Hank replied. Usually takes 3 hours on horseback, but we'll need to go slower. My gelding, Thunder, can carry us both if we're careful. The prospect of riding double with this man sent an unexpected flutter through Virginia's stomach. I've never ridden astride, she admitted. Hank's eyes crinkled with amusement. Well, there's a first time for everything, Virginia. By mid-morning, Virginia felt strong enough to attempt the journey. Hank had found a spare shirt in his saddlebags, clean, if well worn for her to change into, as her own dress was soiled from days of fever. With her skirts hitched scandalously high and Hank's steadying hand at her waist, Virginia found herself settled before him on Thunder's broad back. Hold onto the saddle horn, Hank instructed, his breath warm against her ear as he reached around her to take the reins. Lean back against me if you need to rest. The closeness was both alarming and comforting. Virginia had never been in such proximity to a man not related to her, yet there was something undeniably safe about being enclosed in Hank's arms as Thunder picked his way down the rocky trail. They rode in companionable silence for the first hour, the vast Arizona landscape unfolding around them. The rugged beauty of the territory was more apparent with each passing mile. Towering mesas, saguaro cacti standing like sentinels, and the distant purple shadows of mountains on the horizon. It's beautiful, Virginia murmured, watching a red-tailed hawk circle lazily above. In a harsh way. That's Arizona for you, Hank replied, his chest rumbling against her back as he spoke. Beautiful but unforgiving, demands respect. Is that why you stayed, the beauty of it? Hank was quiet for a moment. Partly, but mostly because out here a man is judged by what he does, not where he comes from or who his daddy was. The land doesn't care about your past. Virginia thought about her own reasons for coming west, not just the teaching position, but the chance to reinvent herself away from the constraints of Boston society. I understand that sentiment better than you might think. They stopped at a small creek around noon to rest and water Thunder. Virginia's strength was flagging, though she tried not to show it. Hank helped her down from the saddle, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary before he busied himself with unstopping his canteen. Virginia settled carefully on a flat rock, watching as Hank checked Thunder's hooves with practiced movements. There was something captivating about the way he moved, efficient, purposeful, yet gentle with the animal. You said the school term hasn't started, she said, accepting the jerky he offered. Do you know if the schoolhouse is prepared? I was supposed to arrive early to set things in order. From what I heard, the town's been getting it ready. New roof, fresh paint. Hank settled beside her, though with a respectful distance between them. Folks in Promise Creek have been looking forward to having a proper teacher. Last one left 2 years ago to get married, And what about accommodations? I was told there would be a room at the boarding house. Mrs. Whitaker runs it. Good woman if a bit nosy. Hank smiled slightly. Makes the best apple pie in the territory, though. The conversation drifted to the people of Promise Creek, the mayor who also served as the town's only lawyer, the blacksmith whose wife ran the general store, the young doctor who had arrived just 6 months prior. With each description, Virginia felt her anxiety ease. These people sounded like a community, not unlike the small Massachusetts town where she'd grown up before her father had moved them to Boston. "And what about you?" she asked as they prepared to continue their journey. "Do you visit Promise Creek often?" Hank helped her back onto Thunder before mounting behind her. "Every few weeks for supplies. The Triple C is about 20 miles west of town. Will you be staying in town tonight?" The question slipped out before Virginia could consider its implications. Hank's hands paused on the reins. "Hadn't thought that far ahead. Usually camp at the ranch's line shack when I'm in these parts." Virginia nodded, feeling oddly disappointed. She told herself it was merely concern about facing a strange town alone after her ordeal, nothing more. They continued eastward, the terrain gradually shifting from rocky foothills to more open country. Virginia found herself leaning more heavily against Hank as the journey wore on, her body still weak from illness. He seemed to understand without words, one arm moving to support her more securely around the waist. "Not much further," he murmured. "See that rise ahead? Promise Creek lies just beyond it." Virginia nodded, steeling herself for what was to come. She would need to explain her absence, settle into her role as teacher, begin her new life. The prospect felt overwhelming after the intensity of the past few days. "Hank," she said softly, "I don't know how to thank you properly." His arm tightened slightly around her. "No thanks needed." "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Virginia said with sudden certainty. "Not anyone. What you did, it was extraordinary kindness." She felt rather than heard his intake of breath, but before he could respond, they crested the rise and Promise Creek came into view below them. It was larger than Virginia had expected, perhaps 30 buildings arranged along a main street, with smaller dwellings scattered beyond. A church steeple rose prominently at the far end, and even from this distance, she could see people moving about their business. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said. "Grown some these past few years. Silver was discovered in the mountains to the north. Not a big strike, but enough to bring folks in." They descended toward the town, and Virginia felt a curious mixture of anticipation and regret. Her time alone with Hank was coming to an end, and while she was grateful for the prospect of proper care and accommodations, there was something about this quiet, steady man that had come to represent safety in her mind. As they approached the outskirts of town, people began to notice them. A young boy spotted them first, pointing and running toward what Virginia presumed was the main street. By the time Hank guided Thunder to the hitching post outside a white clapboard building with "Doctor" painted on a neat sign, a small crowd had gathered. "That's her. That's the teacher lady." The excited voice belonged to a woman in her 40s, wearing an apron dusted with flour. "We thought you were dead with the others." Virginia felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention, grateful for Hank's steadying presence as he helped her down from the saddle. Her legs wobbled beneath her, partly from the long ride and partly from nerves. A clean-shaven young man pushed through the crowd, medical bag in hand. "I'm Dr. Wilson. Let's get you inside, Miss Bennett. You look like you've had quite an ordeal." Hank kept a supportive arm around her waist. "She's been ill with fever. Better now, but still weak." The doctor nodded, leading the way into his office. Virginia glanced back at the assembled townspeople, then up at Hank. "Will you stay?" she asked quietly. Something flickered in his eyes, reluctance, perhaps, at being the center of attention, but also resolution. "Of course." The next few hours passed in a blur. Dr. Wilson examined Virginia thoroughly, pronouncing her on the mend but in need of rest and nourishment. "Mrs. Whitaker, the boarding house owner, arrived with clean clothes that had been donated by various townswomen upon hearing of Virginia's survival. The mayor, a portly man named Harrison, stopped by to welcome her officially to Promise Creek. Through it all, Hank remained a quiet, steady presence in the corner of the doctor's office, only stepping outside when propriety demanded during Virginia's examination. When Mrs. Whitaker declared that a room was ready at the boarding house, it was Hank who helped Virginia make the short walk down the street, ignoring the curious glances from townspeople. The boarding house was a two-story structure painted a cheerful yellow, with white gingerbread trim and a wide front porch. Inside, it smelled of lemon polish and fresh bread. Mrs. Whitaker, chattering continuously, led them to a small but pleasant room on the first floor. Normally, the teacher stays upstairs, but in your condition, dear, I thought this might be easier. It's right next to the kitchen, so you'll get the benefit of the stove's warmth. Now I've put fresh linens on the bed and there's a pitcher and basin on the washstand. Supper's at 6 sharp, but I'll bring you a tray today so you can rest. Virginia thanked her, feeling simultaneously grateful and overwhelmed by the woman's enthusiastic care. When Mrs. Whitaker finally bustled out, promising to return with tea, Virginia sank onto the edge of the bed with a sigh. She's energetic, she said with a faint smile. Hank chuckled, standing awkwardly by the door. That she is. Heart of gold, though. A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken things. Virginia realized with a pang that this was goodbye. Hank had fulfilled his promise. He'd brought her safely to town, ensured she received proper care. There was no reason for him to stay longer. You'll be heading back to the Triple C, I suppose, she said, trying to keep her voice light. Hank shifted his weight, hat in his hands. Not right away. Need to collect those supplies I came for originally, probably head out tomorrow. Virginia nodded, inexplicably relieved at the small reprieve. Well, then perhaps I'll see you before you go. Count on it. His blue eyes held hers for a long moment. Get some rest now, Virginia. As he turned to leave, Virginia called after him, Hank. When he paused in the doorway, she continued softly, Thank you for keeping your promise, about not leaving me alone. His expression softened. Some promises are easier to keep than others. With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Virginia with the curious sensation that something important had begun, rather than ended. True to her word, Mrs. Whitaker returned with tea and what seemed like an inexhaustible supply of questions about Virginia's ordeal and her rescuer. Virginia answered as politely as possible while providing minimal details, her Boston reserve asserting itself against the frontier woman's friendly prying. Such a stroke of luck that Hank Calloway found you, Mrs. Whitaker said, pouring a second cup of tea without waiting for Virginia to request it. Not many men would have stopped at that old cabin, much less stayed to nurse a stranger. He was very kind, Virginia agreed, wondering if the heat in her cheeks was visible. Mrs. Whitaker's shrewd eyes suggested it was. Hank's a good man, keeps to himself mostly but always lends a hand when needed. Half the unmarried women in the county have set their caps for him, but he doesn't seem to notice. Virginia sipped her tea, unsure how to respond to this information. Of course, Mrs. Whitaker continued, a schoolteacher has to be above reproach. Promise Creek is progressive compared to some places, but they still expect certain standards from their educator. The gentle warning was clear enough. Virginia straightened slightly. I assure you, Mrs. Whitaker, my relationship with Mr. Calloway is one of rescuer and rescued, nothing more. The older woman patted her hand. Of course, dear, now you should rest. The whole town's eager to meet you properly when you're stronger. After Mrs. Whitaker left, Virginia lay back on the bed, her thoughts in turmoil. The landlady's comments had forced her to confront the feelings that had been growing during her time with Hank, feelings that were entirely inappropriate given their brief acquaintance and her position in the community. She was here to teach, to build a new life, not to develop an attachment to a cowboy she barely knew, no matter how kind his eyes or gentle his hands. And yet, as she drifted towards sleep, It was Hank's deep voice she heard in her mind. "You'll never be alone again, Miss Bennett." Virginia slept through dinner and straight through the night, waking only when sunlight streamed through the boarding house window. For a disorienting moment, she expected to see the rough walls of the abandoned cabin, but the cheerful floral wallpaper and polished furniture quickly reminded her where she was. A knock at the door preceded Mrs. Whittaker's entrance with a breakfast tray. "Good morning, dear doctor. Wilson stopped by already, but I told him you were sleeping so soundly I didn't have the heart to wake you. He'll be back later. How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you," Virginia said, sitting up against the pillows. It wasn't mere politeness, she did feel stronger, her head clearer than it had been in days. "Wonderful. Several town council members would like to meet with you today if you're up to it, and Reverend Phillips wants to show you the schoolhouse." Virginia nodded, though the prospect of meeting so many people seemed daunting after her isolation. "That would be fine. And, has Mr. Calloway collected his supplies yet?" Mrs. Whittaker's eyes twinkled knowingly. "He was at the general store first thing this morning, but I believe he mentioned to Mr. Potter that he had some business at the livery stable as well. Thunder threw a shoe on your journey, apparently." Virginia tried not to appear too interested in this information. "I see. Well, I should like to thank him again before he leaves." After breakfast, Virginia felt strong enough to dress properly in the borrowed clothes, a simple blue calico dress that was slightly too large but clean and presentable. Mrs. Whittaker helped her arrange her hair, tusking over its condition after days of illness. "We'll have your trunks from the stage office by tomorrow," the landlady promised. "Sheriff Thomas recovered them from the crash site. Seems they fell clear of the wreckage." Virginia's heart lifted at the news. Those trunks contained everything she owned, her clothes, books, and the few keepsakes she'd brought from Boston. "That's wonderful news." Just as she finished dressing, another knock came at the door. Mrs. Whittaker opened it to reveal Mayor Harrison and a tall, distinguished man introduced as Judge Blackwood, head of the town council. Behind them stood a slight man in clerical collar who could only be Reverend Phillips. The next several hours were filled with polite conversation, explanations of her duties as Promise Creek's teacher, and a tour of the nearby schoolhouse. Virginia was impressed by the building, recently whitewashed, with new slate boards and enough desks for 20 pupils. The townspeople had clearly taken pride in preparing for their new teacher. "Term begins in 2 weeks, Reverend Phillips explained. "We have 18 children enrolled, ages 6 to 16. Most will attend only until harvest, I'm afraid, but the winter months should give you a full classroom." Virginia nodded, already making mental notes about how to manage the different age groups. "And what curriculum has been established?" The men exchanged glances. "We leave that largely to your discretion, Miss Bennett," Judge Blackwood said. "Your references from Boston were most impressive. We trust your judgment in educational matters." The vote of confidence was both flattering and intimidating. Virginia had taught before, but only as an assistant in a well-established school with rigid guidelines. Here, she would be creating a program from scratch. As they walked back toward the boarding house, Virginia caught sight of a familiar figure emerging from the livery stable across the street. Hank was leading Thunder, the horse freshly shod and groomed. He looked different in the daylight of town, still unmistakably a cowboy with his worn leather vest and hat, but somehow more formal than he'd been at the cabin. Judge Blackwood followed her gaze. "Ah, Calloway, fine young man. His uncle's ranch supplies most of the beef for Promise Creek." Calvin Calloway was one of the first settlers in these parts. Virginia nodded, wondering if she should acknowledge Hank or wait for him to notice her. The decision was made for her when he glanced up, saw their group, and tipped his hat respectfully before leading Thunder toward them. "Gentlemen," he greeted, then turned to Virginia with a softer expression. "Miss Bennett, you're looking better today." "Thanks to your care, Mr. Calloway," she replied, conscious of the listening ears around them. "I was hoping to thank you properly before you departed." Mayor Harrison clapped Hank on the shoulder. "The whole town owes you a debt for saving our teacher, Calloway. Join us for lunch at the hotel. My treat." Hank hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Appreciate the offer, Mayor, but I should be getting back to the Triple C. Uncle Calvin's expecting these supplies." "Surely your uncle would understand a slight delay," Judge Blackwood said. "After all, it's not every day a man rescues a lady in distress. Quite the heroic tale." Virginia saw Hank's discomfort growing and interceded. "Perhaps another time, gentlemen. I'm certain Mr. Calloway has responsibilities that can't wait." She turned to Hank. "Might I have a word before you go, though, to express my gratitude properly?" The men exchanged knowing glances that made Virginia blush, but they politely excused themselves, promising to return in an hour to escort her to lunch at the hotel. Once they were alone on the boardwalk, Hank relaxed visibly. "Thank you for that. Not much for being the center of attention." "I noticed," Virginia said with a small smile. "Walk with me." They strolled slowly down the street, Thunder's reins in Hank's hand. Promise Creek was bustling with midday activity, and Virginia was acutely aware of the curious glances cast their way. "Mrs. Whitaker tells me my trunk survived the crash," she said. "A small miracle." "Good news," Hank agreed, "though that blue suits you." The unexpected compliment brought color to Virginia's cheeks. "Thank you, it's borrowed, of course." They walked in silence for a few moments, neither quite looking at the other. Finally, Virginia stopped and turned to face him. "I wanted to thank you properly, away from prying ears. What you did finding me, staying with me when you could have simply fetched help, it was extraordinary, Hank." His eyes met hers, serious beneath the brim of his hat. "Anyone would have." "No," she interrupted gently. "Not anyone. What you did was. It mattered. I mattered to a stranger who had no reason to care." Hank was silent for a long moment. "You weren't a stranger for long," he finally said, his voice low. The words hung between them, fraught with meaning neither was ready to articulate. Virginia found herself unable to look away from his face, noticing for the first time a small scar above his right eyebrow, the way the corners of his eyes crinkled slightly even when he wasn't smiling. "Will you return to Promise Creek soon?" she asked, the question emerging more breathlessly than she'd intended. "I come for supplies every few weeks," he said. "More often when Uncle Calvin has business with the bank." Virginia nodded, irrationally pleased by this information. "Then perhaps we'll meet again. Count on it." The same words he'd spoken at the boarding house, but weighted differently now. A call from down the street broke the moment, Mayor Harrison waving to indicate the hour had passed. Virginia sighed, reluctant for this conversation to end. "You should go," Hank said, reading her thoughts. "They're waiting." "Yes." She hesitated, then extended her hand formally. "Safe travels, Mr. Calloway." He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. Instead of shaking it, he held it for a moment, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. "Take care of yourself, Virginia." As she rejoined the waiting town officials, Virginia glanced back to see Hank mounting Thunder. He looked toward her once, touched the brim of his hat in farewell, then turned his horse westward toward home. The following 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity as Virginia settled into Promise Creek. The townspeople were universally welcoming, if overly curious about her ordeal and rescue. She found herself becoming adept at deflecting questions about her time alone with Hank, focusing instead on her plans for the school. Her trunks arrived intact, allowing her to reclaim her own clothes and books. Dr. Wilson pronounced her fully recovered from her illness, though he recommended continuing with willow bark tea for any lingering symptoms, advice that always brought Hank to mind, remembering how he'd prepared the bitter brew in the cabin. The schoolhouse was ready ahead of schedule, and Virginia spent long hours organizing her materials and preparing lessons. Promise Creek had never had a formally trained teacher before, and she was determined to establish high standards from the beginning. She met many of her future pupils and their parents during these preparations. The children ranged from shy to boldly curious, but all seemed eager to begin lessons. Several of the older boys had clearly been pressed into service by parents who valued work over education, but even they showed interest when Virginia mentioned her plans to include practical mathematics and land surveying in the curriculum. Throughout it all, Virginia found her thoughts returning frequently to Hank. She told herself it was natural to think of the man who had saved her life, but in quiet moments she admitted the truth was more complicated. Something had formed between them during those hours at the cabin, a connection that defied the brevity of their acquaintance. "Miss Bennett," Virginia started, realizing Mrs. Whittaker had been speaking to her. They were sitting in the boarding house parlor, Virginia supposedly reviewing student enrollment records while the landlady mended linens. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whittaker. My mind wandered." The older woman smiled knowingly. "I asked if you'd heard the news. Hank Calloway is hosting a harvest dance at the Triple C next month. The whole town's invited." Virginia's heart quickened. "A dance? Oh yes, the Calloways do it every year, their way of thanking the community for its business. Everyone attends." Mrs. Whittaker's needle flashed in the lamplight. "I'm sure you'll receive a proper invitation soon. As our teacher, you're an important person in Promise Creek now." Virginia tried to appear only politely interested. "It sounds lovely." "It is indeed." The Calloway Ranch House is the grandest in the county, built when they first came west before the war, and Hank Calloway spares no expense. There'll be a proper band from Tucson and food enough for an army. Mrs. Whittaker paused significantly. "I imagine his nephew will be there as well." Virginia kept her eyes on the enrollment papers. "I imagine so, it being his home." Mrs. Whittaker chuckled. "You know, dear, there's nothing improper about a friendship with Hank Calloway. Many in town owe him favors, myself included. During the drought 2 years ago, he personally delivered water barrels to every household when our well ran low." Virginia looked up, surprised by this revelation. "He didn't mention that. He wouldn't. Not one for boasting, our Hank." Mrs. Whittaker set aside her mending. "The point is, dear, that while a schoolteacher must maintain certain standards, friendship with a respected member of the community is entirely appropriate." Was the woman actually encouraging what Virginia had thought she'd been warning against earlier? "Mrs. Whittaker, all I'm saying," the landlady continued with a significant look, "is that you needn't avoid the man who saved your life out of concern for appearances. Promise Creek isn't Boston." With that enigmatic statement, Mrs. Whittaker gathered her mending and bid Virginia good night, leaving her to wonder just how transparent her feelings had been. The school term began the following Monday. Virginia stood at the door of the schoolhouse, bell in hand, watching as children arrived in 2s and 3s. Some came on horseback, others in wagons with parents, and a few on foot from town. By 9 o'clock, all 18 of her enrolled students were seated at their desks, faces ranging from excited to apprehensive to deliberately bored among the older boys. "Good morning," Virginia began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I am Miss Bennett, and I am honored to be your teacher." The first day went better than she'd dared hope. The children were respectful if lively, and even the reluctant older boys showed interest during the geography lesson when Virginia described the great cities of the East. By dismissal time, she felt cautiously optimistic about the term ahead. As the children filed out, Virginia noticed a rider approaching a woman on a chestnut mare, dressed in practical riding clothes. She dismounted gracefully and tied her horse to the hitching post before approaching Virginia with a friendly smile. "Miss Bennett." "I'm Vanessa Calloway, Calvin's daughter. I hope I'm not interrupting." Virginia shook the offered hand, noting the family resemblance immediately. Vanessa had the same blue eyes as Hank, though her hair was lighter, almost golden in the afternoon sun. "Not at all, Miss Calloway." "School has just dismissed for the day." Vanessa laughed. "Please call me Vanessa. Miss Calloway makes me sound like a spinster aunt." She glanced around the schoolyard. "Father sent me with an invitation for you." We're hosting our annual harvest dance in 3 weeks, and we'd be honored if you'd attend. Virginia accepted the embossed card Vanessa extended. Thank you. Mrs. Whittaker mentioned the dance. It sounds lovely. It's the social event of the season, Vanessa said with mock grandeur, then laughed again. Actually, it's one of the few chances we all have to dress up and pretend we're civilized. I hope you'll come. I'd be delighted, Virginia said, genuinely pleased by the invitation and Vanessa's friendly manner. Wonderful, Vanessa glanced toward town. I'm heading to the general store for supplies. Would you care to join me? I'd love to hear how your first day went. Virginia hesitated only briefly before agreeing. She gathered her things, locked the schoolhouse, and walked with Vanessa toward town. The other woman was easy to talk to, asking thoughtful questions about Virginia's background and her impressions of Promise Creek. My cousin mentioned you're from Boston, Vanessa said as they approached the general store. It must be quite an adjustment. Your cousin? Virginia asked, though she knew perfectly well whom Vanessa meant. Hank. Vanessa's smile was knowing. He was quite concerned about your recovery. Asked me to check on you when I came to town. Virginia felt warmth spreading across her cheeks. That's very kind of him. That's Hank, Vanessa agreed. The kindest man I know, though he'd hate to hear me say so. She paused before entering the store. He'll be at the dance, you know. He usually tries to avoid these social gatherings, but father insists the whole family attend. I see, Virginia said, trying to sound merely politely interested. Vanessa's laugh suggested she wasn't fooled. I think you'll find the Triple C quite impressive, Miss Bennett. And perhaps you'll save a dance for my cousin. He's actually quite graceful when he can be convinced to participate. Before Virginia could formulate a proper response, Vanessa was leading the way into the store, changing the subject to the latest shipment of fabrics that had arrived from back east. Later that evening, alone in her room at the boarding house, Virginia examined the invitation by lamplight. The card was simple but elegant, inviting her to the Calloway Ranch on Saturday, October 12, 1878, for the annual harvest celebration. A note at the bottom indicated that transportation would be provided for those in town without their own conveyance. Virginia ran her fingers over the embossed letters, trying to imagine the ranch and the family that lived there. Vanessa had been so welcoming, so unlike what Virginia might have expected from the daughter of a wealthy rancher. And Hank had asked his cousin to check on her. The thought warmed her more than it probably should. She placed the invitation on her small writing desk and opened her trunk, pushing aside books and personal items until she found what she was looking for: a dress she'd brought from Boston, more formal than anything she'd worn since arriving in Promise Creek. The deep green silk was perhaps a touch too elaborate for a frontier dance, but it was the best she had. As she held the dress against herself, Virginia caught her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with anticipation. She looked, she realized with a start, like a woman preparing to meet a suitor, not merely attending a community function. This is foolishness, she told her reflection sternly. You barely know the man. But the reflection seemed unconvinced, and Virginia had to admit that her heart wasn't in the admonishment. The truth was, she was eager to see Hank again, to discover if the connection she'd felt was real or merely a product of their unusual circumstances. The next 2 weeks passed quickly, filled with teaching duties and preparations for the harvest dance. Word spread quickly that the new schoolteacher would be attending, and Virginia found herself the recipient of much good-natured teasing from her pupils and their parents. My pa says you'll be the belle of the ball, Miss Bennett, announced 8-year-old Sarah Potter during lunch recess. Your pa is very kind, Virginia replied, hiding her amusement, but I'm simply looking forward to meeting more members of the community. My brother says Hank Calloway's sweet on you, contributed 12-year-old Thomas Wilson, the doctor's son. Says he asks about you whenever he's in town. Virginia felt her cheeks warm. That's quite enough, Thomas. Please finish your lunch so we can begin our arithmetic lesson. The children giggled but obeyed, leaving Virginia to wonder just how much local gossip was circulating about her and Hank. It was both mortifying and oddly thrilling to think they were the subject of speculation. The Friday before the dance, Virginia was closing the schoolhouse when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart leapt foolishly, but it was Vanessa who appeared, not Hank. "Miss Bennett, I'm glad I caught you," Vanessa called, dismounting with her usual grace. "Father sent me to confirm you have transportation for tomorrow. We're sending wagons for the townspeople at 4 o'clock. "That's very kind," Virginia said. "I'll be ready." Vanessa hesitated, then said with a mischievous smile, "I should warn you that half the unmarried men in the county are planning to ask you to dance tomorrow. You've become something of a local celebrity." Virginia groaned. "Hardly the reputation I was hoping for as the schoolteacher." "Oh, it's all very respectable admiration," Vanessa assured her. "And besides, I happen to know at least one man who might be hoping for more than a dance." Virginia's cheeks flamed. "Miss Calloway, Vanessa, I'm not sure what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything," Vanessa interrupted with a laugh. "I'm stating quite directly that my cousin has been impossible to live with these past weeks. He pretends it's about the cattle drive preparations, but I know better." She leaned closer, as if sharing a secret. "Hank doesn't talk much, as you may have noticed, but when he does mention you, his voice changes." Virginia didn't know how to respond to such a direct statement. "We barely know each other," she finally managed. Vanessa's expression softened. "Sometimes that doesn't matter as much as we think it should." She mounted her horse again. "I'll see you tomorrow, Miss Bennett. Wear something pretty." As Vanessa rode away, Virginia stood motionless, her mind whirling with the implications of their conversation. Could it be true that Hank felt the same inexplicable connection she did? Or was Vanessa simply matchmaking, as unmarried women often did for their bachelor relatives? The next day dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the harvest celebration. Virginia spent the morning helping Mrs. Whittaker prepare dishes for the community potluck that would accompany the dance, then devoted the afternoon to her appearance. She washed her hair and arranged it more elaborately than usual, with soft curls framing her face. The green silk dress fit perfectly, its modest neckline and long sleeves balanced by a flattering cut that emphasized her slender waist. At precisely 4 o'clock, wagons arrived in Promise Creek's town square. Virginia joined other townspeople boarding the conveyances, noting with some amusement that everyone seemed to have made special effort with their appearance. Even gruff old Mr. Peterson, who ran the livery stable, wore a freshly pressed shirt and had trimmed his usually wild beard. The journey to the Triple C took nearly an hour, giving Virginia ample time to appreciate the changing landscape. As they traveled west, the terrain became more rugged, with impressive rock formations rising from the plains. Finally, they crested a hill, and the Calloway Ranch spread before them. Virginia's breath caught. The main house was indeed grand, a sprawling 2-story structure of stone and timber, with a wide veranda wrapping around 3 sides. Behind it stood a cluster of outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses, all meticulously maintained. The setting sun cast everything in golden light, making the scene appear almost magical. "Impressive, isn't it?" Mrs. Whittaker said beside her. "Calvin Calloway built that house for his wife, God rest her soul, wanted her to have all the comforts she'd left behind in Virginia." As their wagon approached, Virginia could see people already gathering on the grounds. Lanterns hung from trees and fence posts, tables had been arranged for the potluck dinner, and a platform had been constructed for the musicians, who were tuning their instruments. Calvin Calloway himself greeted them as they disembarked, a tall, distinguished man with silver-streaked dark hair and the same blue eyes as his daughter and nephew. "Welcome to the Triple C," he said warmly, helping Virginia down from the wagon. "You must be Miss Bennett. I've heard much about you." "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Calloway," Virginia replied, wondering exactly what he'd heard and from whom. "My pleasure. Any friend of my nephew's is welcome here." His eyes twinkled in a way that reminded her strongly of Vanessa. "Speaking of whom, I believe Hank is around here somewhere." "Vanessa, come show Miss Bennett around while I greet the other guests." Vanessa appeared, resplendent in a blue dress that matched her eyes. "Miss Bennett, you look lovely. That green is perfect with your coloring." Virginia accepted the compliment with a smile, allowing Vanessa to lead her through the gathering crowd. They stopped at the refreshment table, where Vanessa procured cups of punch for them both. "Hank's been watching for your arrival," Vanessa said without preamble. "He's helping the musicians set up at the moment, but I'm sure he'll find you soon." As if summoned by his name, Hank appeared at the edge of the gathering. He was transformed from the trail-worn cowboy Virginia remembered, clean-shaven, hair trimmed, wearing dark trousers and a crisp white shirt with a string tie. He was speaking to one of the musicians, pointing toward the platform, but as if sensing her gaze, he looked up. Their eyes met across the distance, and Virginia felt her breath catch. Hank stared for a long moment, then excused himself from the musician and started toward them. "Right on time," Vanessa murmured with satisfaction. "I'll leave you two to get reacquainted." Before Virginia could protest, Vanessa slipped away into the crowd, leaving her alone as Hank approached. "Miss Bennett," he said, coming to a stop before her, "you look—" He paused, seeming to search for an adequate word. "Beautiful." The simple compliment, delivered with such evident sincerity, warmed Virginia more than elaborate flattery could have. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway. You look quite handsome yourself." A hint of color touched his tan cheeks. "Hardly recognize myself all cleaned up like this." "Uncle Calvin insists on propriety for these gatherings." "It suits you," Virginia said, then felt herself blush at her own boldness. Hank's expression softened. "I'm glad you came. I've wondered how you were settling in." "Very well, thank you." The school term has begun promisingly, and everyone has been most welcoming. They fell into an awkward silence, neither quite looking at the other. Virginia searched for something to say, something beyond the polite formalities that seemed so inadequate. "Would you show me around?" she asked suddenly. "Your cousin started the tour, but we didn't get far." Relief crossed Hank's face at having a purpose. "I'd be honored." He offered his arm, and Virginia placed her hand upon it, acutely aware of the solid strength beneath the fine fabric of his shirt. They strolled through the gathering, Hank pointing out features of the ranch and introducing her to hands and neighbors she hadn't yet met. "And that's the main house," he said, gesturing to the impressive structure. "Uncle Calvin built it in '52, before the territory was even properly organized. Wanted Aunt Alina to have a proper home out here in the wilderness." "Mrs. Whittaker mentioned your aunt. She's passed away," Hank nodded. 10 years ago, influenza hit the whole county hard that winter." "I'm sorry," Virginia said softly, hearing the old grief in his voice. Hank's expression grew distant. "She was a fine woman, treated me like her own when I came here after the war, never had children of her own, so she spoiled Vanessa and me something fierce." Virginia realized this was the most personal information Hank had shared with her. "You and your cousin seem close." "Like siblings, really. She's a year younger, came to live with Uncle Calvin after her parents died in a riverboat accident. We grew up together." Hank glanced toward where Vanessa was chatting animatedly with a group of young people. "She's been trying to marry me off for years, says I need someone to talk to besides my horse." Virginia laughed, both at the comment and the exasperated affection with which it was delivered. "She mentioned something similar to me, actually," Hank groaned. "I should have known." "I apologize for her meddling." "No apology needed," Virginia assured him. "She's been very kind to me." The musicians began playing a lively tune, drawing people toward the area cleared for dancing. Hank hesitated, then turned to Virginia with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "Would you care to dance, Miss Bennett?" The formal invitation, delivered with such earnestness, touched Virginia deeply. "I would be delighted, Mr. Calloway." As they joined the other couples, Virginia was conscious of curious glances cast their way. Clearly, The connection between the new schoolteacher and the Calloway foreman was of interest to more than just Vanessa. Hank proved to be a capable dancer, leading Virginia confidently through the steps of the Virginia reel. His hand at her waist was gentle but sure, and when their eyes met during a turn, Virginia felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the exertion of the dance. "You dance very well," she said as the music ended. "Aunt Alina insisted," Hank replied with a small smile. "Said no nephew of hers would disgrace the family by clomping around like a bull in a china shop." Virginia laughed, and Hank's smile widened in response. The sound of her laughter seemed to please him, and she realized how rarely she'd had cause for mirth during their previous interactions. The evening continued pleasantly, with Virginia dividing her time between Hank and other members of the community who sought her company. True to Vanessa's prediction, several unmarried men asked her to dance, but it was Hank she found herself watching for whenever they were separated. As dusk deepened into night, lanterns cast a golden glow over the gathering. After a particularly energetic dance with Mayor Harrison's son, Virginia excused herself to get some air, walking to the edge of the gathering where the veranda of the main house offered a quiet vantage point. She was admiring the stars, so much brighter here than in Boston, when she heard footsteps behind her. "Mind some company?" Hank asked, offering a cup of punch Virginia accepted gratefully. "Thank you. I was just admiring the night sky. I've never seen stars so brilliant." Hank leaned against the veranda railing beside her, looking upward. "One of the things I love about this country. No matter how rough the day's been, those stars come out at night, same as always." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the music and laughter from the dance forming a pleasant backdrop to their private conversation. "Virginia," Hank said finally, his voice low and serious, "there's something I've been wanting to say to you." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes." He turned to face her, his expression earnest in the lantern light. "That day at the cabin when I found you, I've seen a lot in my years out here, but the thought of you suffering alone like that." He shook his head, seeming to struggle for words. "What I'm trying to say is, finding you was." "Hank, there you are," Calvin Calloway's voice interrupted whatever Hank had been about to confess. "The Petersons are leaving, and they wanted to say goodbye to you before they go." Hank's jaw tightened briefly, but he nodded to his uncle. "Of course, I'll be right there." As Calvin retreated, Hank turned back to Virginia with an apologetic look. "I'm sorry. We'll continue this conversation later, I'd like that," Virginia said, disappointment warring with anticipation in her chest. As the evening progressed, however, Virginia found herself continuously separated from Hank by various social obligations. He was called away to help with a minor issue at the stables, then engaged in conversation with a cattle buyer from Tucson. Virginia, meanwhile, was drawn into discussions with parents of her pupils, and an impromptu meeting with Judge Blackwood about expanding the school's library. By the time the wagons were being readied for the return journey to Promise Creek, Virginia had nearly given up hope of speaking privately with Hank again. She was gathering her shawl when he appeared at her side. "You're leaving," he said, the words more statement than question. "Yes, Mrs. Whitaker is waiting." Virginia gestured toward where the landlady stood by the nearest wagon. Hank nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Virginia, about what I was trying to say earlier, Miss Bennett, we're ready to depart," called Mrs. Whitaker. Virginia bit her lip in frustration. "I have to go." Hank's shoulders slumped slightly, but he recovered quickly. "I understand. Would it be all right if I called on you in town, perhaps next Saturday?" The formal request, so unexpected, made Virginia's heart leap. "Yes, I'd like that very much." A genuine smile broke across Hank's face, transforming his serious features. "Until Saturday, then." As the wagon pulled away from the Triple C, Virginia found herself looking back, watching Hank's figure grow smaller in the distance. Around her, tired but happy townspeople discussed the evening's events, but Virginia remained quiet, lost in thoughts of a conversation interrupted and the promise of next Saturday. The following week passed with agonizing slowness. Virginia threw herself into her teaching duties, but her thoughts constantly strayed to Hank and what he might have been trying to tell her at the dance. By Friday, even her pupils had noticed her distraction. "Miss Bennett, you wrote the same problem twice," pointed out 13-year-old Emma Potter during arithmetic. Virginia blinked at the slate board, realizing the girl was right. "So I did. Thank you, Emma." She erased the duplicate problem, conscious of the curious glances exchanged among her older students. After dismissing class, Virginia lingered at the schoolhouse, organizing books and preparing Monday's lessons. As she worked, she found herself rehearsing potential conversations with Hank, what she might say, how she might respond if he confessed the feelings she hoped he harbored. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself. "You're behaving like a lovesick schoolgirl, not a professional educator." And yet, as Saturday dawned clear and bright, Virginia spent far more time than usual on her appearance, selecting her best day dress, a cornflower blue that complemented her eyes, and arranging her hair with special care. Mrs. Whittaker noticed immediately at breakfast. "My, don't you look lovely today, Miss Bennett. Any special occasion?" Virginia sipped her coffee to hide her blush. "Just enjoying the fine weather, Mrs. Whittaker." The landlady's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "Of course, dear. And if that enjoyment happens to coincide with a certain gentleman's visit to town, all the better." News traveled quickly in Promise Creek, too quickly for Virginia's comfort. She excused herself from the table and retreated to her room, only to find herself too restless to focus on the book she'd been reading. Finally, she decided to walk to the general store for supplies she didn't really need, simply to occupy herself until Hank's arrival. The morning air was crisp, hinting at the approaching winter. Virginia nodded greetings to townspeople as she passed, conscious of the speculative glances that followed her. By now, everyone in Promise Creek seemed aware that Hank Calloway was calling on the new schoolteacher today. At the general store, Mr. Potter greeted her with unusual enthusiasm. "Miss Bennett, what a pleasant surprise. Looking for anything in particular today?" "Just some writing paper, Mr. Potter," Virginia replied, browsing the shelves to avoid his too interested gaze. Of course. "Just got a fresh shipment from back east. Quality stuff." He bustled to retrieve it from behind the counter. "Lovely day, isn't it? Perfect for riding." Virginia murmured agreement, painfully aware of the man's transparent attempt to reference Hank's impending visit. She paid for her purchase and left quickly, deciding that the schoolhouse might offer refuge from prying eyes until Hank arrived. She was just unlocking the schoolhouse door when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the west. Turning, Virginia saw Hank riding toward town, his familiar figure instantly recognizable even at a distance. Her heart leapt foolishly, and she chided herself for such a strong reaction. Hank spotted her as he entered the town proper, raising a hand in greeting before directing thunder toward the livery stable. Virginia waited by the schoolhouse, watching as he disappeared into the stable, then emerged a few minutes later on foot. He dressed carefully, she noted as he approached his best shirt from the harvest dance, freshly pressed trousers, boots polished to a shine. He carried his hat in his hands, revealing hair still damp from combing. "Miss Bennett," he greeted her, his voice warm despite the formality. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all," Virginia replied, suddenly shy in his presence despite the anticipation that had built all week. "I was just attending to some school matters." Hank nodded, glancing at the schoolhouse behind her. "Would you care to show me inside?" "I haven't seen it since the renovations were completed." Grateful for the neutral topic, Virginia led him into the one-room schoolhouse. Hank looked around with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about her teaching methods and the children's progress. His sincere engagement with her work touched Virginia deeply. "You've done wonders with the place," he said, examining the maps she'd hung on the walls. "These children are fortunate to have you as their teacher." "Thank you," Virginia replied, warmed by the compliment. "I'm enjoying it more than I expected. The children are eager to learn, even the older boys who pretend indifference." Hank smiled. I was one of those boys once. Thought I was too grown for schooling by 14, much to my mother's dismay. This glimpse into his past intrigued Virginia. And yet you seem well educated now. Aunt Alina again, Hank said with a rueful smile. When I came here after the war, she discovered I could barely read beyond basic words. Spent every evening for 2 years drilling me in reading, writing, and figures. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. Hank's expression grew distant for a moment, then refocused on Virginia. Would you care to walk? It's a fine day and there's a pleasant trail along the creek. Virginia agreed eagerly, locking the schoolhouse behind them. As they walked through town toward the creek path, she was acutely aware of the curious glances cast their way. But Hank seemed oblivious, pointing out features of Promise Creek and sharing anecdotes about its founding. The creek path took them away from prying eyes, winding through cottonwoods whose leaves had turned golden with autumn. Here, away from the town's scrutiny, Hank seemed to relax, his stride lengthening and his conversation flowing more easily. I used to fish here as a boy, he said as they paused at a bend in the creek. Uncle Calvin would bring Vanessa and me on Sundays after church. She hated the worms but loved catching the fish. Virginia smiled, picturing a younger Hank and Vanessa by this same water. You've lived here a long time. Most of my life, Hank confirmed, except for the war years and some time in Texas afterward. He hesitated, then asked, Do you miss Boston? Virginia considered the question seriously. Parts of it, the libraries, the theaters. But not the society with its rigid expectations. She looked out over the sparkling water. I came west seeking something different, something freer. Hank studied her face. And have you found it? I believe I'm beginning to, she said softly, meeting his gaze. Something shifted in Hank's expression, a decision made, perhaps. He gestured to a fallen log nearby. Would you sit with me a moment? There's something I need to say, and I'd rather not be interrupted again. Virginia's heart quickened as they settled on the log, a respectable distance between them. Hank seemed to gather his thoughts, his hands clasped before him, eyes on the flowing creek. I'm not good with words, Virginia, he began. Never have been, but I need to tell you. He paused, then continued with quiet determination. When I found you in that cabin, something happened to me. Seeing you there so ill and alone, it changed something in me. Virginia sat very still, hardly daring to breathe as he continued. I've lived most of my life keeping to myself. The war showed me the worst in men, and afterward I figured it was safer that way, but then there was you. He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. I know it hasn't been long, I know this might seem sudden or foolish, but I can't stop thinking about you, Virginia Bennett. The simple, honest declaration touched Virginia more deeply than the most poetic profession of love could have. Hank, he held up a hand gently. Please let me finish before I lose my nerve. Taking a deep breath, he continued, I don't expect you to feel the same. You're educated, refined, you could have your pick of suitors far more suitable than a weather-beaten cowboy. But I needed you to know that when I promised you wouldn't be alone again, I meant it. Not just in that moment, but always, if you'd allow it. Virginia felt tears prick her eyes at the raw sincerity in his voice. Hank Calloway, she said softly, do you really think I care about suitable suitors? Hope flickered in his eyes. What do you care about then? Kindness, she said without hesitation. Honor. The sort of man who would stay with a stranger in need, who would place her welfare above his own convenience. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. The sort of man I haven't been able to stop thinking about since he rode away from the boarding house 2 weeks ago. Hank's expression transformed, hope blossoming into joy that he seemed to be trying to contain. You mean that? With all my heart, Virginia confirmed, her own smile breaking free. Whatever this is between us, it may have started in unusual circumstances, but I believe it's real, Hank. I feel it too. Hank reached for her hand, his calloused fingers closing gently around hers. I know it's too soon to speak of future plans, but I want you to know my intentions are honorable, Virginia. I'm not a wealthy man, though I have savings and Uncle Calvin has promised me land of my own one day, but I could provide for you, give you a good life. Virginia squeezed his hand. I didn't come west seeking wealth, Hank. I came seeking purpose and perhaps happiness. She smiled. I believe I may have found both. The joy that spread across Hank's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. May I call on you properly, court you as you deserve? I would like nothing better, Virginia replied, her heart full to bursting. They walked back toward town slowly, reluctant to end their time together but conscious of propriety. As they approached the boarding house, Hank stopped, still holding her hand. I have to return to the Triple C today. We're preparing for a cattle drive next week. But I'll be back in Promise Creek next Saturday if that's agreeable. Very agreeable, Virginia assured him. Hank hesitated, then said quietly, I'll think of you every day until then. The simple promise warmed Virginia through. And I you. With another press of his lips to her hand, bold by Promise Creek standards, but restrained compared to the emotions Virginia could see in his eyes, Hank bid her goodbye and headed toward the livery stable to retrieve Thunder. Virginia watched him go, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As she turned toward the boarding house door, she found Mrs. Whittaker watching from the window, her expression a mixture of approval and barely contained curiosity. With a light laugh, Virginia climbed the steps to face the inevitable questions, knowing that for once she wouldn't mind the town's interest in her affairs. Something precious had begun today beside Promise Creek, something worth sharing. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm centered around Hank's Saturday visits. True to his word, he arrived in Promise Creek each weekend, sometimes staying only for the day, sometimes overnight at the town's small hotel when ranch duties allowed. Their courtship progressed with a proper regard for conventions that nonetheless couldn't disguise the deepening connection between them. November brought cooler weather and the conclusion of the cattle drive. Hank returned with tales of the journey to the railhead in Tucson, the proceeds from which had secured the Triple C-Ticus prosperity for another year. Virginia listened eagerly, finding his descriptions of life on the trail far more fascinating than the dime novels she'd once read back east. As Thanksgiving approached, Virginia received an unexpected invitation from Hank Calloway to join the family at the Triple C for the holiday. We'd be honored to have you at our table, the note read in Vanessa's flowing hand. Hank would have delivered this invitation himself, but he's been called to Prescott on business for the ranch. He'll return by Thanksgiving and hopes very much you'll accept. Virginia did accept, touched by the family's inclusion of her. Mrs. Whittaker helped her prepare a pumpkin pie for the occasion, offering well-meant but transparent advice about impressing potential in-laws throughout the process. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold. Mayor Harrison, who was also traveling to the Triple C with his family, offered Virginia a place in his wagon. The journey passed pleasantly, with Mrs. Harrison asking interested questions about the school term and the mayor sharing news of territorial politics. The Triple C looked even more impressive in the clear winter light than it had during the harvest dance. Smoke curled invitingly from the main house's chimneys, and evergreen boughs decorated the veranda rails in honor of the holiday. Vanessa greeted them at the door, resplendent in a burgundy dress that complemented her golden hair. Miss Bennett, I'm so glad you could come. Father's in the parlor with the other guests and Hank, she broke off with a grin. Well, Hank's been watching the road since dawn. As if summoned by his name, Hank appeared in the hallway behind his cousin. He wore a dark suit Virginia hadn't seen before, his hair neatly combed, but it was the joy that transformed his face at the sight of her that took Virginia's breath away. You came, he said simply, stepping forward to take her hands. Of course I did, Virginia replied, conscious of Vanessa's delighted observation but caring only for the warmth of Hank's touch and the light in his eyes. The Thanksgiving celebration proved to be everything Mrs. Whitaker had described and more. The Calloway dining room accommodated 20 guests with ease, the table laden with traditional dishes and southwestern specialties. Calvin Calloway presided at the head, his silver hair gleaming in the candlelight as he offered a heartfelt blessing for the meal. Virginia, seated between Hank and Vanessa, found herself treated not as a guest, but almost as family. Calvin addressed questions to her about the school, seeming genuinely interested in her educational philosophy and plans for her pupils. Other guests, neighboring ranchers and prominent Promise Creek citizens, included her naturally in conversations, with no hint of the outsider treatment she'd half expected. "You've made quite an impression on my uncle," Hank murmured as servants cleared the main course. "He doesn't usually talk this much at gatherings," Virginia smiled. "He's been very welcoming. You're fortunate in your family, Hank." "I know it," he agreed, his eyes warm as they met hers. "And I hope to be even more fortunate in the future." The quiet words, laden with meaning, sent a thrill through Virginia. Before she could respond, however, Calvin rose to propose a toast to absent friends and family, and the moment passed. After dinner, the gathering moved to the spacious parlor for music and conversation. Vanessa played the piano beautifully, accompanying Judge Blackwood's daughter, who had a lovely soprano voice. Virginia found herself seated beside Calvin on a comfortable settee, watching as Hank conversed with Mayor Harrison across the room. "He's a changed man since he found you," Calvin said quietly, following her gaze to his nephew. "Happier than I've seen him since before the war." Virginia turned to the older man, surprised by the direct comment. "Mr. Calloway," Calvin raised a hand gently. "No need for explanations, Miss Bennett. I've watched Hank grow from a troubled boy into a fine man. He carries burdens from the war that he never speaks of, but these past weeks, those burdens seem lighter." His blue eyes, so like Hank's and Vanessa's, studied her face. "Whatever is between you two, it has my blessing." Touched beyond words, Virginia could only nod her thanks. Calvin patted her hand paternally before rising to refill his glass, leaving Virginia to contemplate his words. Later, as the evening waned and guests began preparing to depart, Hank found an opportunity to speak with Virginia privately. He led her to the veranda, where the crisp night air provided relief from the parlor's warmth. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "It's not much, but when I saw it in Prescott, I thought of you." Virginia unwrapped the gift carefully to reveal a small silver brooch in the shape of a book, its cover etched with delicate scrollwork. "Oh, Hank," she breathed. "It's beautiful." "For the teacher," he said with a smile, "to pin your shawl or wear on your collar." The thoughtfulness of the gift moved Virginia deeply. "I shall treasure it always," she said, meaning every word. She pinned it immediately to the collar of her dress, delighting in Hank's pleased expression. "Virginia," he began, his voice low and serious. "These past weeks have been the happiest of my life. I know our courtship has been brief by Eastern standards, but out here," he gestured to the vast landscape beyond the ranch house. "Out here, we learn to recognize true value quickly." Virginia's heart quickened at his tone. "Yes, we do," she agreed softly. Hank took her hands in his. "I don't want to rush you or presume too much, but I want you to know that my feelings for you are profound. When I'm ready to speak of them more formally, I hope you'll listen with an open heart." The careful words, clearly rehearsed and delivered with such earnest hope, touched Virginia more deeply than a flowery declaration could have. "Hank Calloway," she said, squeezing his hands, "when that day comes, you'll find my heart more than ready to hear you." Relief and joy spread across his face. He lifted one hand to gently touch the brooch at her collar, his fingers brushing lightly against her throat in a touch that sent warmth cascading through her. "Until then, know that each day I spend with you only confirms what I felt that first day in the cabin, that finding you was the greatest blessing of my life." Virginia had no words to match such a declaration. Instead, she leaned forward and, casting propriety momentarily aside, pressed a swift, gentle kiss to his cheek. "Thank you for finding me, Hank," she whispered before stepping back to a respectable distance. The look in his eyes, surprise melting into tenderness, stayed with Virginia long after she had returned to Promise Creek with the Harrisons. That night, lying in her bed at the boarding house, she touched the silver brooch on her nightstand and allowed herself to imagine a future she had never dared dream of, before coming west, a future with a man whose quiet strength and inherent goodness had come to mean everything to her. December brought colder weather and preparations for Christmas. The school term would break for 2 weeks over the holiday, and Virginia threw herself into organizing a Christmas pageant for her pupils to perform before the break. Hank's visits continued faithfully each Saturday, and their relationship deepened with each meeting. On the final school day before Christmas, after the successful pageant that had the whole town applauding the children's performances, Virginia returned to the boarding house to find a letter waiting for her. The Boston postmark made her heart sink. Correspondence from her stepmother rarely brought good news. The letter, written in her stepmother's precise hand, contained unexpected information. Virginia's maternal grandmother, whom she had rarely seen since her mother's death, had passed away, leaving Virginia a modest but significant inheritance. "The solicitor requires your presence in Boston to settle the estate," her stepmother wrote with obvious disapproval. "I have informed him that you have taken employment in some savage Western territory, but he insists the matter cannot be resolved by post alone. If you wish to claim your inheritance, you must return east by February at the latest." Virginia sat heavily on her bed, the letter trembling in her hands. The inheritance itself was welcome news. The financial security it would provide could make a significant difference to her future. But the requirement to return to Boston, even temporarily, filled her with conflicting emotions. Mrs. Whittaker's gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Calloway is here to see you." Virginia hastily tucked the letter into her desk drawer. "Thank you, Mrs. Whittaker. Please tell him I'll be right out." She took a moment to compose herself before joining Hank in the boarding house parlor. He stood when she entered, his smile warming her despite her troubled thoughts. "The children were wonderful today," he said, having attended the pageant along with most of the town. "You've done remarkable work with them in such a short time." "Thank you," Virginia replied, accepting the compliment with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Hank's brow furrowed slightly. "Is something wrong?" Virginia hesitated, then decided honesty was best. "I received a letter from Boston. My grandmother has passed away and left me an inheritance, but I must return east to claim it." Concern replaced Hank's worried expression. "I'm sorry about your grandmother. When would you need to leave?" "The letter says I must be in Boston by February." Virginia watched his face carefully. "I would only stay as long as necessary to settle the estate, a few weeks at most." Hank was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. "February," he repeated. "That's after the school term resumes." Virginia nodded. "I would need to request a leave of absence from the school board. Perhaps Reverend Phillips could supervise the children temporarily." Hank seemed to be working through practical considerations. "The journey's not easy in winter. You'd need to take the stage to Tucson, then the train east." "Yes," Virginia agreed, warmed by his practical concern rather than immediate objection to her departure. "It's not ideal timing, but the inheritance, it could make a significant difference." Hank's eyes met hers directly. "To our future, you mean?" The simple acknowledgement of their shared future, spoken so matter-of-factly, made Virginia's heart swell. "Yes, Hank, to our future," he nodded decisively. "Then you must go. We'll make arrangements for your journey and ensure your position is secure upon your return." "You're not concerned about my returning to Boston?" Virginia asked carefully. Understanding dawned in Hank's eyes. "That you might prefer to stay there, you mean?" When Virginia nodded, he reached for her hand. "Virginia Bennett, I've seen how you've taken to life here, how you care for your pupils, how you've embraced this community. I don't doubt for a moment that you'll return." He paused, a hint of vulnerability showing through his confident exterior. "Unless there's something in Boston that might change your mind." "Nothing," Virginia said firmly. "My life is here now, Hank, with my school with Promise Creek." She squeezed his hand. "With you." The smile that broke across his face was like sunshine after rain. "Then go to Boston with my blessing. Settle your affairs, claim your inheritance, and come back to us. To me." They spoke more practically then, discussing the logistics of the journey and the timing of her return. Hank insisted on accompanying her at least as far as Tucson when the time came, and Virginia gratefully accepted. The prospect of the long journey seemed less daunting with his support. As Christmas approached, Virginia pushed thoughts of the Boston journey aside, determined to enjoy the holiday. The Triple C was hosting another gathering on Christmas Eve, and this time Virginia traveled there with Hank himself, who arrived in Promise Creek with a proper buggy rather than horseback. "Uncle Calvin's," he explained as he helped her into the vehicle. "Said a lady shouldn't have to ride astride in this cold." The journey to the ranch passed quickly, the buggy's enclosed design protecting them from the worst of the winter wind. Virginia found herself studying Hank's profile as he handled the reins, noting the strong line of his jaw, the slight crinkles at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. "You're staring, Miss Bennett," he said without looking away from the road, though his lips curved upward. "Admiring the view, Mr. Calloway," she replied with a boldness that surprised herself. Hank's laugh, rich and warm, filled the buggy. "Careful now, talk like that could give a man ideas." "Perhaps that's the intention," Virginia said softly. Hank glanced at her then, his eyes darkening with an emotion that sent warmth coursing through her despite the December chill. "Virginia Bennett, you continue to surprise me. In good ways, I hope," she said, suddenly uncertain of her boldness. His expression softened. "In the best possible ways." The Christmas Eve celebration at the Triple C was more intimate than the Thanksgiving gathering, with only the Calloway family and their closest friends in attendance. Virginia was touched to be included in this inner circle, and even more moved when Calvin presented her with a gift, a beautiful leather-bound collection of Shakespeare's works. "Every home should have good books," the older man said warmly. "And I understand from Vanessa that the Bard is a particular favorite of yours." Later, as the evening drew to a close, Hank led Virginia to a quiet corner of the parlor, away from the others who were gathered around the piano for carols. "I have something for you as well," he said, withdrawing a small package from his pocket. Virginia unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small wooden box, exquisitely carved with wild roses around the edges. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the detailed workmanship. "Open it," Hank urged softly. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. Virginia's breath caught, her eyes flying to Hank's face. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice low and intense. "One of the few things I have from her. Virginia, I know you're leaving for Boston soon, and I want you to go with the certainty of my feelings. I love you. I think I've loved you since I found you in that cabin, though it took me time to recognize it for what it was." Tears welled in Virginia's eyes as Hank continued, taking her hands in his. "I'm not asking for your answer now, that wouldn't be fair with your journey ahead, but I want you to know that when you return, I'll be waiting with a proper proposal." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "The ring is yours regardless of your answer, a token of my love and commitment. Wear it or keep it as you choose while you're away, but know that my heart goes with you to Boston and will be waiting here when you return." Virginia was speechless with emotion, tears slipping down her cheeks. Hank reached up to gently brush them away with his thumb. "I've rendered you speechless," he said with a soft smile. "I should mark this day on the calendar." That broke Virginia's emotional paralysis. "Hank Calloway," she said, voice trembling but firm, "I love you too. I have for longer than I've been willing to admit to myself." Joy transformed his face as he lifted the ring from its box. "May I?" Virginia nodded, extending her left hand. Instead of placing it on her ring finger, however, Hank slipped it onto the chain that held her mother's locket, which Virginia always wore around her neck. "Until I can place it properly," he explained, his fingers brushing her collarbone as he fastened the chain again. "Something to remember me by in Boston." "As if I could forget," Virginia whispered, overcome with emotion. Conscious of the gathering just yards away, Hank restrained himself to pressing a kiss to her forehead, but the tenderness in the gesture spoke volumes. "Merry Christmas, Virginia." "Merry Christmas, Hank," she replied, her heart too full for more words. January brought preparations for Virginia's journey east. The school board readily granted her leave of absence, with Reverend Phillips agreeing to supervise the pupils during the 3 weeks she anticipated being gone. Hank was a constant presence, helping with practical arrangements and offering reassurance when Virginia's anxiety about the journey surfaced. They had agreed not to formalize their engagement until after her return, but the understanding between them was clear to anyone who saw them together. Mrs. Whittaker had spotted the pearl ring on Virginia's chain during a particularly enthusiastic hug and had barely contained her delight, though she respected Virginia's request not to spread the news just yet. The day of departure arrived too quickly. Virginia's trunks were packed, arrangements made for her absence, and goodbyes said to her pupils. Hank arrived at dawn with the buggy to transport her to Tucson, where they would catch the eastbound train the following morning. The journey to Tucson was bittersweet, filled with conversation about Virginia's expected experiences in Boston and plans for her return. They spent the night in separate rooms at a respectable hotel near the station, dining together in the restaurant where Hank presented her with a final gift, a small journal bound in red leather. "For your thoughts while we're apart," he explained. "And perhaps to record your impressions of Boston for me." Virginia promised to fill every page, touched by his thoughtfulness. They parted at her hotel room door with a bittersweet embrace, both knowing the next morning would bring their temporary separation. At the station, as the train prepared to depart, Hank held Virginia's hands tightly. "3 weeks," he said. "I'll be here waiting when you return." "3 weeks," Virginia echoed, memorizing his face, the feel of his hands around hers, the love in his eyes. "I'll write as soon as I arrive." "Be safe," Hank said, his voice rough with emotion. "Remember that someone is waiting for you to come home." "Home," Virginia repeated, the word filling her with certainty. "Yes, I'll be coming home to you, Hank." The conductor called the final boarding, and Virginia reluctantly pulled away. Hank helped her up the steps, pressing one last kiss to her hand before stepping back as the train began to move. Virginia watched from the window as his figure grew smaller, his hand raised in farewell until the train rounded a bend and he disappeared from view. The journey east was long but uneventful. Virginia spent the hours writing in her journal and reading, her thoughts constantly returning to Promise Creek and the man waiting for her there. By the time she arrived in Boston, stepping onto the familiar platform at South Station, she felt like a different person than the Virginia Bennett who had left nearly a year before. Her stepmother's welcome was as cool as expected, though she had arranged for Virginia to stay at her maternal aunt's home rather than the family residence, an arrangement that suited Virginia perfectly. The business of the inheritance proved more complex than anticipated, requiring meetings with solicitors and bank officials that stretched into the second week of her stay. Throughout it all, Virginia wrote faithfully to Hank, describing her activities and the strange sensation of being back in Boston as a visitor rather than a resident. His letters in return were less frequent due to the mail service, but treasured all the more for their rarity, detailed accounts of ranch activities, news from Promise Creek, and always expressions of love and longing for her return. As the legal matters progressed, Virginia made a significant decision. Rather than leaving the inheritance in Boston banks, she arranged to transfer the funds to Tucson, where they could be accessed more easily for their future plans. The solicitors were surprised but eventually accommodated her wishes, though the process added another week to her stay. Finally, nearly 4 weeks after her arrival, all was settled. Virginia packed her trunks, bid farewell to her aunt and a notably absent stepmother, and boarded the westbound train with a heart lighter than it had been since leaving Promise Creek. The return journey seemed both endless and swift, each mile bringing her closer to home, to Hank. In her journal, she sketched plans for their future improvements to the schoolhouse she hoped to implement, ideas for the home they would build together, dreams of the family they might create. When the train finally pulled into Tucson Station, Virginia scanned the platform eagerly, her heart sinking slightly when she didn't immediately spot Hank's tall figure. Then, as passengers disembarked ahead of her, the crowd parted, and there he was, hat in hand, face anxious as he searched the train windows. "Hank," she called, unable to contain herself. His head snapped up, eyes finding hers, and the joy that transformed his features matched the soaring feeling in her own heart. Virginia hurried down the steps, heedless of propriety, and found herself swept into Hank's embrace the moment her feet touched the platform. "You're back," he murmured into her hair, holding her as if he feared she might disappear. Finally, Virginia clung to him just as tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and sun-warmed cotton and home. "I missed you so much," she confessed, drawing back just far enough to see his face. Hank's eyes were suspiciously bright as they searched hers. "Was beginning to worry you'd found Boston more appealing than you remembered." "Never," Virginia said firmly. "My place is here now, with you." Relief and love mingled in his expression. "I have the buggy waiting. Uncle Calvin insisted we stay at the ranch tonight before heading back to Promise Creek tomorrow." He hesitated, then added with uncharacteristic nervousness, "There's something I need to ask you, Virginia." Something that couldn't wait another day. Virginia's heart leapt. "Then let's not delay any longer." They collected her trunks and made their way to the waiting buggy. As they drove through Tucson toward the road that would take them to the Triple C, Virginia told Hank about the successful transfer of her inheritance and the plans she'd sketched in her journal. He listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and offering suggestions of his own. As they approached the Triple C, the winter sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the landscape in gold and pink. Instead of heading directly to the main house, however, Hank directed the buggy toward a rise overlooking the ranch. "I want to show you something," he explained as they came to a stop. Helping Virginia down from the buggy, he led her to the edge of the rise. Below them sprawled the Triple C, the main house and outbuildings bathed in sunset light. But Hank pointed beyond, to a sheltered valley visible in the distance. "That's Cottonwood Valley," he said. "Part of the Triple C land, but separated from the main ranch. Uncle Calvin signed it over to me last week, 200 acres, including that creek we can just see glinting in the sun." Virginia looked from the beautiful valley to Hank's face, understanding dawning. "Your own land," she breathed. Hank nodded, his expression a mixture of pride and hope. "Our own land, if you'll have it. There's good water, plenty of grazing for cattle, and a perfect spot for a house right there by those cottonwoods." His voice softened. "I've been sketching plans while you were gone, nothing fancy but solid, room to grow." Tears filled Virginia's eyes at the care and thought he'd put into their future. "It's perfect, Hank." Taking her hands in his, Hank drew her gently around to face him fully. "Virginia Bennett," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "When I found you in that cabin, I made you a promise that you'd never be alone again. I want to keep that promise for the rest of our lives." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing the small wooden box he'd given her at Christmas. Opening it, he removed the pearl ring from where she'd returned it for safekeeping during her journey. "I love you, Virginia," he said simply. "Your strength, your kindness, your brave heart. I want to build a life with you, a home, a family, a future. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Virginia said without hesitation, her voice clear despite the tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, Hank Calloway, I will marry you." With a hand that trembled slightly, Hank slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly. Then, finally, he drew her into his arms and kissed her a kiss that held all the longing of their separation, all the promise of their future, all the love that had grown between them since that fateful day when she lay sick and alone, and he had whispered a promise that changed both their lives forever. They were married on a perfect spring day in May 1879, with wildflowers carpeting the hills around Promise Creek and cottonwood fluff drifting like snow on the gentle breeze. The ceremony took place in the church where Virginia had directed the Christmas pageant, now filled to capacity with townspeople, ranch hands, and even a few guests from as far away as Tucson and Prescott. Vanessa stood as Virginia's attendant, resplendent in a gown of pale blue silk that matched her eyes. Hank Calloway gave the bride away, his usual reserve melting into genuine emotion as he placed Virginia's hand in his nephew's. And Hank, standing tall and proud in a new suit ordered specially from Tucson, looked at Virginia as if she were the only person in the room. Virginia wore a gown of ivory satin, simple but elegant, with her mother's locket around her neck and wildflowers in her hair. As she spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, she felt the rightness of this moment, this place, this man. When Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers from the assembled guests nearly raised the church roof. The celebration that followed at the Triple C was the most joyous gathering the ranch had seen in years. Tables groaned with food, musicians played lively tunes for dancing, and even the weather cooperated with warm sunshine and clear skies. As evening fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, creating a magical atmosphere of golden light. During a pause in the dancing, Hank led Virginia away from the festivities, toward the rise where he had proposed months earlier. The moon was rising, silvering the landscape and illuminating the distant valley that would soon be their home. "Construction starts next week," Hank said, his arm around her waist as they gazed toward Cottonwood Valley. "The house should be ready by late summer, God willing, and if the lumber arrives on time." "I can't wait," Virginia said, leaning into his embrace. "Though I'm quite content at the Triple C until then." Hank pressed a kiss to her temple. "Uncle Calvin is beside himself with joy at having you in the family. I think he was beginning to despair of Vanessa or me ever settling down." Virginia laughed softly. "Vanessa told me she has her eye on that new doctor in Prescott, actually, the one she met at our wedding." "Poor fellow doesn't stand a chance," Hank chuckled. "Once Vanessa decides on something, it's as good as done." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, absorbing the beauty of the night and the reality that they were now husband and wife. "Happy, Mrs. Calloway?" Hank asked softly. The new name sent a thrill through Virginia. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she answered honestly, turning in his arms to face him. "And you, Mr. Calloway, any regrets about stopping at that abandoned cabin?" Hank's eyes, silvered by moonlight, held hers with an intensity that still made her breath catch. "Only that I didn't find you sooner." His hand came up to cup her cheek gently. "I love you, Virginia Calloway." "And I love you," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to meet his kiss, a kiss that sealed their promises and spoke of all the years to come. As they walked hand in hand back toward the celebration, Virginia thought of the journey that had brought her here from Boston to a stagecoach accident, from a fever-racked cabin to a schoolhouse, from solitude to the deepest love she had ever known. And she remembered with perfect clarity the words that had changed everything. "You'll never be alone again." Hank had kept that promise and would keep it for all the days to come.